player can die now, but it isn't particularly fun for the player to not have any agency. So now we are going to give the player the ability to fight back. Back in our level 1 scene, we have a new script to add to our player. We need to add the shooter script. So let's go to Scripts, Shooting Projectiles, Shooting Controller, and drag that onto our player game object. Let's take a look now on that shooting controller component on our player and look at its settings. We have a projectile prefab setting, which is where we will put our projectile we want to fire, a projectile holder, which is an optional game object that we could create to hold projectiles in the scene to keep the hierarchy clean. We have an option for whether this shooting controller is player controlled, since the enemies use the script to fire as well. So I want to set this to true because this one is on our player. And then we have a fire rate, which is how fast the projectiles are fired, and a projectile spread, which is how far apart the projectiles are potentially fired from each other. Finally, there's a fire effect we can assign when we have an effect to create for that. Let's get our projectile prefab assigned first. So that's in Prefabs, Projectiles, Player Projectiles, and then let's drag that player projectile into the proper slot. Now if we hit play and hold down our left mouse button or left click, we can fire projectiles now, and since the projectiles are already set up, we can even kill this enemy. But you might notice in the scene hierarchy, it gets filled with these projectiles. Just so many of them. So let's set up the projectile holder next. So to do this, we right click in the scene hierarchy and select Create Empty. Let's rename it to Projectile Holder. And now let's assign this to our player's shooter controller script. Now when we fire a lot of projectiles, we don't completely flood our hierarchy with them. Instead, they get organized under Projectile Holder game object. That's almost everything set up for shooting, except we would like an effect to be created when we fire, so let's build one of those ourselves from our assets. The first thing we need to do is create another empty game object in our scene hierarchy. Let's name it Player Fire Effect. Then we need to add a few components to it. We need to add an audio source and a timed object destroyer. So let's add those using the Add Component button. We can use the search bar for audio source, and then for timed object destroyer. The thing we want to talk about here is the audio source component. Later, we will make effects that use both audio and visuals, but for now, we are creating an effect with just audio so we can focus on this component because it is one of the ways you can get audio into your game. The most important part of the audio source is the audio clip, which for us, we are going to go into our Assets, Audio, Sound Effects, and drag into our audio clip setting the Player Fire Sound. The next important setting for us is the Play on Awake setting, which basically means that this audio source will play its sound as soon as the audio source exists in the scene. So if we hit play right now, we will hear the sound play. Right beneath that setting is the loop option, which we will get to use in a later video when we put in music. For this effect, we don't want it to loop. We just want it to play once and be done. After that, the next setting we should look at is volume, which does what you would expect. It controls how loud the sound is, so if you think it is too loud, you can play around with that setting until you find something that fits with the rest of the sound levels in the game. After that is pitch, which controls how high or low the pitch of the audio is, which we are going to leave at 1. But you can try playing with that setting to see if you like the audio pitched up or down. The next important setting is the spatial blend, which controls how the audio is handled in its game space. At the left side of the slider is 2D spatial blending, which makes the audio play back at the same volume regardless of where in the scene the audio source is in relation to the audio listener. At the right side of the slider is 3D spatial blending, which makes the audio play back based on where it is in the scene in relation to the audio listener. For right now, this audio source is set up the way we want, so let's make this game object into a prefab by dragging it into the proper folder under Prefabs, Effects, Player. Now that it is a prefab, we can give the prefab to our player's shooter script and we can remove the loose effect sitting in our scene so we don't have it playing at the start of our level. If we hit play now, we can hear the player fire effect every time the player fires. One last important thing to do, because some of our scripts rely on it, is to change the tag on the player to player. Now that our player is completely created, let's make it its own prefab by dragging it into our prefabs folder under player. Now when we make more levels, we can drag in our ready-made player from the prefabs and be ready to go.